Good morning. So, one of the things that happens after World War II is you start to see a rise. Actually, it starts after World War One. Is you start to see a rise in nationalists in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, who are like, hey, why are we controlled by this foreign European state? Why aren't we independent? Why are we ruled by someone who doesn't look like us, act like us, talk like us? And one of the places where we're going to talk about a nationalist movement that's going to be successful is in South Asia. One of our big themes after World War II, remember, there's two themes together. It's the Cold War and the decolonization, the end of imperialism. So these two things are happening at the same time. And we're going to start to look at nationalist leaders and new independent states in Asia, in Africa, and in the Americas, in the Middle East, starting today. Now, we're going to have different classes of nationalists. We're going to have those who are successful. We're going to have those who are unsuccessful. We're going to have those who use peaceful tactics to achieve their aims. We're going to look at those who use violence to achieve their ends. And the first place we're going to look at is South Asia. The leader of South Asian nationalism is going to be Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a nationalist leader. He was one of the leaders of the Indian National Congress, and he's going to be the most effective leader in putting moral and political pressure on the British to withdraw. If you'll remember, after World War I, hundreds and thousands of South Asian soldiers who went to the Western Front, tens and thousands of them had died. And there was this real clamoring for an independent nation state after World War I. And instead of granting that, the British actually tightened down control. And it's in the period between the wars that Gandhi really ratchets up the pressure against the British. It's important to know that he is Hindu. There's going to be dual nationalist movements in South Asia. There's going to be the Hindus like Gandhi, who won an independent nation state. But remember, there's also a large Muslim minority who are going to have some serious fears about the creation of a single state that's largely Hindu dominated. But he is a Hindu. Now, he uses nonviolence to put economic and political pressure on the British. Why doesn't he use violent tactics? Why doesn't he lead a giant armed rebellion against the British? Frankly, because he doesn't think it would work. So he asks himself, how else can we hurt the British? And stop and think about it. Why do the British want South Asia? They want South Asia to make money off it. They want access to their cotton. They want access to South Asia as a marketplace for their finished cotton textiles. So Gandhi's response is, hey, let's stop making this colony profitable for Britain. He and his followers will peacefully disrupt the economic systems in Britain. For example, he famously has a sit-in on a railroad crossing where 20,000 of his followers, and he just sit down on railroad tracks and don't let the trains go through. And anytime one of the members is dragged off and arrested, two more come in and sit down. One of his things that becomes a symbol of nationalism in India is, he says, why are we buying British cotton textiles? We have a 3,000-year-old tradition of making our own cotton textiles. Why are we buying their textiles? And his basic point is, one of the ways we can fight for independence is, let's not buy British cloth. Let's go back and make our own. And you see in this picture, this is Gandhi with his spinning loom. This is partially propaganda. This is also partially effective ways of fighting the British. Let's stop buying their stuff. Let's go back to making our own cloth. Let's stop making this colony economically valuable for the British. He's arrested several times. One of the things he does is basically anytime he's arrested, he stops eating in prison, and he just refuses to eat. One of the reasons he does this is he knows how bad it will look for the British if he died in a British prison looking famished. So he's going to be a very, very effective nationalist leader, and he's going to inspire other leaders after him to use nonviolence. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. will be inspired by many of Gandhi's ideas. Martin Luther King Jr. never met Gandhi. I don't understand why people think that is. I don't know if it's something that people are told in middle school that's just wildly incorrect, but he is inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, a South African leader who will fight for the rights of Native Africans against white colonizers in South Africa. And again, using nonviolence to achieve their aims. So some leaders are going to successfully do this. This spinning loom, which is on the current day modern national flag of India, is their national symbol now. This was their way of fighting imperial oppression. Get that into your head out, how they're using nonviolence to try to drive the British out. Now, decolonization happens globally after World War II. After World War II, the two big European colonizers that are left, France and Britain, but there's some others, will slowly free their colonists. Sometimes independence is won through a negotiated exit. For example, South Asia. You're going to need to know that this is a colony that's going to get its independence through negotiation. There's not a war. There's not an armed rebellion. The organization that was the head of decolonization, fighting for independence, is the Indian National Congress. It's headed by Nehru and it's headed by Gandhi. And this is important. It is Hindu dominated. The Indian National Congress wants one free, independent India. This is important to know this. And because Hindus would be the majority group in this state, Hindus would dominate. However, there's a second group in South Asia who's like, no, 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 no. Britain, don't you dare leave. And leave behind only one South Asian state. And those are the Muslims in India. Muslims are horrified and fearful that if the British leave and they leave behind one state, they will become the victims of severe discrimination by this new Hindu-dominated state. And there's a second nationalist movement that is occurring while the Indian National Congress is trying to achieve an independent India, and that's the Muslim League. The head of the Muslim League is a man named Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Jinnah and members of the Muslim League say, Britain, do not leave behind one single South Asian state. If you leave behind two. Leave behind a Hindu state and a Muslim state to ensure that Muslims are not going to become victims of discrimination. So originally, Indian nationalism was, let's have one independent state, and this movement was headed by the Indian National Congress. We gained a lot of support between the two wars. But now there's a second organization saying, leave behind two. This is Nehru. He and Gandhi are the heads of the Hindu-dominated Indian National Congress. He's going to ultimately be the first prime minister of India. Gandhi is never actually a prime minister once India achieves its independence. And this is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the head of the Muslim League. Now, also remember, all of this stuff with decolonization, this is really important, is happening in that same historical backdrop as the Cold War. In 1947, Britain peacefully leaves. And when they leave, they're going to leave behind two states. They are going to leave behind India, which is Hindu dominated and is going to be led by Nehru. Now, Hindu dominated. It doesn't mean that there's not tens and tens of millions of Indians who are Muslim in this state, and that's going to cause issues down the road that we're going to talk about. And they leave behind Pakistan, which is Muslim dominated and led by Jinnah. Now, there's something really interesting you need to realize about Pakistan. Pakistan is divided. This and this are both part of the country of Pakistan. And this is called West Pakistan, and this is called East Pakistan. This was put into this because this was a Muslim dominated region. So instead, and this is going to be very problematic. Can you imagine having a country? It would be like the United States and Alaska if Alaska had lots of people and lots of wealth and lots of value, and we're all one country, but we're separated by thousands of miles. Upon the creation of India, India instantly becomes the world's largest democracy in the British tradition. So these nationalists, they're also liberals. They want liberal style governments, democracy. And many nationalists are. Not all nationalists. We're definitely going to look at some nationalists later on who are going to be communists. But in the case of India, it's fair to call these nationalists liberals as well. Unfortunately, the second these two countries are created, they instantly start to go at one another's throats. There's lots of issues these two states have, and much of it is over this region right here. This region is called Kashmir. And since 1947, these two states will fight several wars, largely over this territory. And these two countries have been at each other's throats, and they still have been at each other's throats ever since the creation of both these states. Now, there's a second problem with the creation of these two states. In Pakistan, there are still millions of Hindus, and in India, there are millions and millions of Muslims. If you're a Muslim in India, you don't want to be a Muslim in India. You want to be a Muslim in Pakistan. And if you're a Hindu in Pakistan, you don't want to be a Hindu in Pakistan. You want to be a Hindu in India. And what you see is after World War II is the largest resettlement of people since World War II, where Hindus in Pakistan go to India and Muslims in India pack everything and go to Pakistan. Now, when these people leave, they're taking with them everything they have in their life because they're never coming back, all of their life possessions. And you've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions of people over the course of 4 years who are bringing everything with them to go to these new states, oftentimes in very isolated regions. And both groups of settlers, resettlers, get attacked by robbers, and in some instances claims that the other side's military attacked them. Both sides with justification can claim that their refugees were attacked. And this is going to lead to even more intense dislike between these two states. There's one United Nations estimate that says 200,000 of these migrants from both sides may have died in this attempted resettlement. This is especially going to lead to increased dislike of Muslims that remained in India. And Muslims have been a persecuted group in India, frankly, ever since its creation. By the way, if you're asking where is Gandhi in all of this, unfortunately, very quickly after India wins independence, Gandhi is assassinated. He's actually assassinated by an extremist Hindu. So it wasn't like he was assassinated by a Muslim who frankly was mentally ill. God forbid what could have possibly happened had he been assassinated by a Muslim. But that's a story that we'll never know the answer to. Now, there have been 4 major conflicts between India and Pakistan. The first one was in 1945, literally the year that these two countries created. They started to go to war with each other. 1965 and 1999. Mostly fought over Kashmir. All are won by India. But the most important conflict happens in 1971. In 1971, East Pakistan had a war of independence from West Pakistan. Basically, it was a civil war. There had been a famine in East Pakistan. They felt like it was large part the leaders of West Pakistan, who by this time were a military dictatorship. And India sees it as an opportunity to weaken an enemy, and they become involved in this war of independence. And ultimately, with India's help, East Pakistan wins independence and creates the modern country in 1971 of Bangladesh. So now there's not just 2 major powers in South Asia, there's 3. And Pakistan has now been split into 2 different states, West Pakistan and Bangladesh. And obviously this just increases the bitterness between Pakistan and India. One of the things that's very worrying about many people in just the political community in the world today is both Pakistan and India now have nuclear weapons. In 1999, they started a skirmish with one another, and it looked like it might develop into a full-blown war. And lots of people globally were afraid of that. The reason they were afraid of that is no 2 countries with nuclear weapons have ever gone to war with one another. And there's almost 2 billion people who live in Pakistan and India combined. And it was probably the closest or the most worrisome that people had since the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there was a potential that 2 states could actually go to nuclear war with one another. Fortunately, those tensions have largely died down, and that's because of the American presence in Pakistan today after the 9/11 attack, when we kind of forced Pakistan to let us use Pakistani territory as a base to launch our fight against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. If you're looking for a silver lining of the 9/11 attacks, it's the increased American presence in South and Central Asia may have stopped a nuclear war where plausibly millions of people could have died. Not an intended consequence, but an unintended consequence. Now, one of the things I just have to throw in somewhere, so we might as well do it here, is that we said there were 2 sides in the Cold War. There were the countries that were capitalist and free and democratic, and those countries were on Team USA. And then there's the countries that were communist, and they were on Team Soviet Union. When I said that, that's not exactly true. There's also a third path. And the third path is called non-alignment. The countries that chose to neither ally themselves with the Soviets or the USA. The non-alignment movement starts in 1961, and India is a leader in non-alignment. You can look at the countries that are involved in the non-alignment movement. These are the countries who were like United States, Soviet Union. If there's going to be a World War III involving nuclear weapons, if it's okay with you, we're going to sit this one out. Now, ultimately, non-alignment is going to hurt all of these countries. Here's why. If there had been a World War III and it had been a nuclear holocaust, these countries would have looked great. They would have looked wise, and I'm not here to criticize them because it definitely looked like there was an imminent possibility for a nuclear disaster. However, that never happened. And here's just a very honest assessment of non-alignment. Ultimately, there was going to be a winner in the Cold War, and that was the U.S. Countries that had allied themselves with the United States, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War, are going to progress more economically, because after the Cold War ends, the United States is the world's leading superpower, spreading economic, political, and social systems. And if you look at all these regions in this non-alignment movement, what do they tend to have in common? Poverty and underdevelopment. And a lot of that was because they did not have some sort of tie to the West and their growing economic systems. So ultimately, by not forging a relationship with the Western states, most importantly the United States during the Cold War, it hurts them long term in their economic development. Now, again, I don't want to sound overly harsh, because if there had been a nuclear holocaust, we'd be looking at them saying, hey, that was a great decision not to get involved in this. But know that India is one of the leaders of non-alignment. Now, one of the problems that South Asia continually had was famine. There are some horrible famines in the 60s and 70s that literally caused hundreds of thousands of people in South Asia to starve to death. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. One of the things, though, that starts in the 1960s is something called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is incredibly important, and I need you to understand and pay close attention to this. The Green Revolution was developed by an American named Norman Borlaug. Okay, Borlaug, I don't give a lot of opinions in this class. Borlaug genuinely, at his heart, was a humanitarian. He was a fairly humble person, and he had seen poverty, especially in Mexico. He worked in Mexico for years, trying to come up with a way to increase the food production of Mexico to help solve their problems. And he creates genetically modified seeds using industrial tools, pesticides, and chemicals to dramatically increase the amount of food that can be grown globally. Now, when I say Borlaug is a genuinely decent person, it doesn't mean that there's not a ton of unintended consequences. Okay? He was very single-minded. We have to make more food to feed more people. We have to make more food to feed more people, without looking at larger complications of that. And we're going to talk about those things as we get through this. Mexico and India are the first states to adopt his techniques. We're going to talk about this leader in just a second. But the most famous and probably important prime minister in Indian history is a woman named Indira Gandhi, not related to Mahatma Gandhi. She is the daughter of Nehru. She's desperate to make India self-sufficient with their food. India is dramatically is importing in incredibly large amount of food from foreign states, most importantly the United States. And she wanted to cut those ties and make India self-sufficient. So India is one of the earliest adopters of the Green Revolution. You're going to see his seeds, which are the most important part of this, the pesticides and chemicals used, and the end result is India will dramatically increase food production, so that by 1980, India is self-sufficient with their food. They are producing enough food for themselves, which is something that hadn't been true for a long time. The good news, no more food shortages, and famines will not be a major issue. However, there's an incredible environmental cost with using large-scale pesticides and chemicals in your farming. And there's a social cost too. The social cost is workers are losing their identity. Workers are are no longer the skilled labor that had in farming that had made them an important part of the Indian hierarchy. And there's many critics who say that the Green Revolution doesn't solve the most serious problems with India. And there's another thing that happens. What happens when you start to produce more food? Well, when people are more secure in their food, you start to see them produce more children. And there's a huge population spike in India. It is projected that by 2050, India will surpass China as the world's largest population. And this is directly a result of the fact that they are one of the first states to implement the Green Revolution. Understand that the Green Revolution is a global movement, and it large scale wipes out famine. Like, that's the good. But again, a really harsh environmental cost that many of its critics will say is actually long-term detrimental. Now, speaking of Indira Gandhi is prime minister twice from 1966 to 1977 and 1980 to 1984. She is the daughter of Nehru, the first prime minister. One of the problems you're going to see in Indian politics is, yes, they're a democracy, but almost all of the Indian prime ministers are in some way, shape, form, or fashion related to Nehru. Just because you're a democracy doesn't mean you can't have a dynasty of leaders. And there have been lots of accusations that there's been corruption in Indian democracy, especially in the 60s and 70s, not so much now. She's the first woman elected leader of a major democratic state. Again, she's not just the leader of any democratic state. She's the leader of the world's largest democratic state. However, while she likes to portray herself as a liberal, during her first reign, she gives herself emergency powers that granted her increased political power, which the last time we looked at someone who did that, it was Adolf Hitler. Fundamentally, during the middle of the 70s, she was a dictator. She imprisons political opposition. She rules with an iron fist. She's the one who saw the successful prosecution of the war against Pakistan in the Bangladeshi War of Independence. She's the one who brings in the Green Revolution to give India, help make India self-sufficient with its food. She supported non-alignment. She also was prime minister when India created its first nuclear bomb in a project called Smiling Buddha, which I've always thought was a little bit funny. That was the name. We're going to look at her economic policies in just a little bit, but I do want you to get this story of Indira Gandhi. So in 1977, as many people who have assumed total power can do, her head gets big, her ego gets inflated, and she decides to have a nationwide election to give the power so that the power she's given herself can be justified, to show that she actually has the support of the people. And in her head, and reading the press that she had created, she thought she was going to win this election. So she grants an election and she loses in 1977. So she gets thrown out of power. And then in the next election, 1980, she wins that election, and that's why she becomes prime minister in the second time. She's ultimately assassinated by two of her Sikh bodyguards. Here's one for you. So in 1984, and it's a complicated story, there was clashes between Sikhs and the Indian military over things that Indira Gandhi was doing at Sikh shrines. She was claiming that some terrorists were hiding there, and she destroyed some holy shrines to the Sikhs. And many have said that she overstepped her bounds, and who she arrested and persecuted and killed lots of people who didn't have anything to do with this clash with the Indian government. Well, if you're going to destroy a bunch of Sikh holy shrines, maybe not a great idea to have as your bodyguards, several of your bodyguards be Sikh. And she was actually murdered by two of her bodyguards. in reaction to the crackdown that she had been committing on the Sikhs in 1984. Now, all this stuff that I've told you is great. What they are really interested in College Board in is the economic policies of Indira Gandhi. So really make sure you understand this. She is a socialist, okay? She believes that government should be part of the solution to the problems of the people economically. Now, she's not a communist, okay? All communists are socialists, not all socialists are communists. She's not trying to take over all the systems. She's not trying to take over all land development. She's not trying to take over all business, okay? But she believes, remember what we talked about the difference between a socialist and a communist. Now, we are really interested in this unit in leaders who support free market and liberal capitalism, and leaders who think governments need to be actively involved in their economy. So take a second, ask yourself, who are some other leaders of the 20th century who believe that governments have an active role to play in solving the problems of the state? Can you name 3? I'm going to sit here awkwardly for 10 seconds and see if you can think and figure out 3 other leaders besides Gandhi. All right. So, first of all, any communist leader. So that would be Stalin. That would be Mao Zedong. Also, Franklin Roosevelt. Remember, what was his solution to getting the United States out of the Great Depression? Government programs. So, you got one Democrat, you've got 2 communists, you got a socialist. So it really does cross the spectrum, and how they do it is very different. Also, you could have thrown in here Adolf Hitler. His solution was government spending and building up the military. She's going to nationalize the banks. She's going to nationalize some other key industries. Nationalizing means make government controlled. Her biggest goal was to make India self-sufficient in agriculture. She does that by supporting the Green Revolution, which I've already talked about. She's going to spend a lot of money building up infrastructure. She builds roads. She builds trains. She builds electric grids. She increases military spending because there's always those wars threatening with Pakistan. And another enemy that India is concerned with is China. And they actually fight a very small, brief war under Indira Gandhi's reign, where India and China share a border. So India and China do not get down. And that's another reason for increased military spending. Also, it just makes her stronger. Her policies are genuinely seen to be a failure. She had a series of 5-year plans that were supposed to have projected economic growth, and rarely did she meet them. She fails to make India an industrial power, which was one of her goals. Stop and think about it. How many times have you ever bought something that says made in India? And the answer to that question is not very often. Many of her goals was to make India an industrial power, and it just doesn't work out. She's hurt by a troubled relationship with the United States. Non-alignment is one element. The United States, for the first half of her reign before she adopts the Green Revolution, India was buying grain from us, and this was a problem. She's a socialist. She's not into free market capitalism, so that puts her policies at odds with the United States. She had a fairly friendly relationship with the Soviets, which doesn't do well for her relationship with the United States. But most importantly, her programs did little in poverty. In India, there are hundreds of millions of people during her time in power that did not have running water, did not have electricity, that lived in very, 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 very real poverty. And her policies really don't solve that problem. And poverty in India is still a major problem. It's being dealt with in South Asia. And again, lots of it has to do with under economic development. The Indian explosion in their economy that we saw in China has not taken place yet. in the second largest country on earth, again, one of the big themes is rural poverty. And she doesn't do anything successfully in that. Now, there's one other term I need to give you. We're going to see this in other places, but let's go ahead and talk about it now. And that's a metropole. Quattro, what is a metropole? One of the interesting phenomenons that takes place globally is this. You colonize my country, and then you set us free. And I look around in this new, free, independent country I live with, and I see lots of uncertainty, lots of destable political systems, lots and lots of questions and uncertainty that scare me. And what you see happen is oftentimes when a colony becomes independent, the elites in that country, the educated workers, the skilled labor will say, yeah, I'm out. And they will actually migrate to their former colonizer, and they'll form their own communities. This is called a metropole. Millions of Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi will migrate to England after England grants South Asia its independence. They see a place that doesn't have a bright future, and they're like, we're out. We're going to go to England where our skills and ability we know we'll get compensated for in a stable environment. If you've ever gone to London, you walk down the streets, you'll see tons of people who are very clearly South Asian in their ancestry. Now, oftentimes this will result in something called a brain drain. Now, the stereotype of South Asians in places like Britain and the United States is, oh, they're so much smarter than us. That's not true. South Asians as a group are no smarter than anybody else. Then where does this myth come from? It comes from who's leaving South Asia. It tends to be educated. It tends to be more intelligent. It tends to be people who have means. That is not an accurate cross-section of the Indian population as a whole, okay? And what oftentimes happens is when these metropole communities are formed is what we call it a brain drain. The groups of people that South Asia needed the most to build a stable economy and future are the ones leaving. The elites, the people who controlled capital, educated workers, skilled labor, all the people we really need to stay here to build a better future, they're the ones leaving. This is going to contribute in some manner to the economic issues that South Asia is going to have. By the way, I'm not criticizing the people for leaving. I probably would have done the same thing. Another example of a metropole community is after World War II. The Philippines had been an American colony. We set the Philippines free. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos migrate to the United States. When you have these metropole communities, you introduce new culture and economic systems into your home state. There are people who now say the national dish of England is no longer fish and chips, it's curry. That's the most popular food in in England today. Want to make a note. South Asians in the United States are not metropoles. You have to move from your original place to the place that was colonizing you to be considered a metropole. So yes, South Asians who come to the United States are migrants, but we don't call these communities in the United States a metropole. However, and I would be interested in my people of South Asian ancestry to chime in on this. I bet you that whoever first left India in your family history, I'll bet you that the first place many of them went to was England, and that very few of those migrants went directly from India to the United States. But that's just a hypothesis. Anyway, this is one story of independence, and this is one story of the struggles of a new state being created after successfully and peacefully breaking away and forming a nation state We're going to look at other examples of decolonization in our next few classes. Hope you've had an awesome day. Stick around and I will give you your work